In this lesson, we're going to begin to see how to build a class by writing a constructor that will initialize the fields of the name class, which is the example we're going to use. So we'll start off by opening a file called name.py. In this particular example, we're going to put the class definition in the same file as our working program. But later on in the course, I'll show you how to move a class definition into its own module. The first thing we do when we want to define a class is use the keyword class, followed by the name of the class. And in this case, the name is name, which is kind of confusing. Class names are usually capitalized to distinguish them from other types of objects, such as variables and functions. Following the class name, we have a colon. In most other languages, you have to declare variables first, and in another language such as Java, right here we would declare the fields that are going to define the attributes of our class. But because we don't have to declare variables in advance in Python, we can move straight to something called the constructor. The constructor is used to perform something called instantiation, which is just a fancy way of saying we want to create an instance of a class. Each instance of a class is a separate object, and those objects have to be created or instantiated, and it's the job of the constructor to perform that instantiation. A constructor is a function, although in object-oriented programming terms we don't talk about functions, we call functions methods. So constructors will be the first type of methods that we learn how to create. The constructor is a special type of method and it has its own particular name. It's called init. And notice that it's preceded by 2 underscores and followed by 2 underscores. It's a built-in name, in other words, and we use it exactly like that. After the constructor name, we provide a parameter list, and the parameter list always starts off with a parameter named self. Self refers to the current instance of a class, and I'll explain more about what that means in a minute. Then we follow that with the parameters that will define the rest of our class, in this case the name, so that'll be first, middle, and last. Then in the body of the constructor, we'll write self.first equals first because our first field, the first piece of data to define a name, is the first name. We use self, again, because it's talking about the current object, the current instance. Then we say self.middle equals middle, and self.last equals last. Now, before we go on and define any more of the class, which we'll do in the coming lessons, let me go ahead and show you how we would create an instance of the class. We just provide a variable name, then we use the class name, followed by an open parenthesis, followed by the data that makes up the name. Now getting back to the keyword self, when this code is executed, self is referring to the current object, which will be a name. And in Python, you almost always have to reference a field using self. So we write self.first, meaning we're talking about the first name of this object. And then self.middle is talking about the middle name of the a name object. And then self.last references the last name of this current object when this line is being executed. If we created another object, then at the time of instantiation, self is referring to that object. So that wraps up this lesson on constructors and fields. And we're ready to move on to the next lesson where we're going to talk about how to write methods to go with our class.